During the air war over Europe, bomber crews talked about most targets in normal voices, but by 1944, one target carried so much dread it was treated like a curse word. Men were terrified to even say its name out loud, reducing it to a fearful whisper. Big B. Berlin. March 6, 1944 was the morning the 8th Air Force decided to stop whispering about it and go there instead. At 27,000 feet above the German capital, the atmosphere was a physical hostility. 55 degrees below zero, thin enough to kill an unprotected man in minutes, so dry it cracked lips through oxygen masks and turned breath into crystals that fogged visors and made the instruments hard to read. The sky at that altitude lost its familiar blue and took on a violet quality, hard and deep and indifferent, the kind of color that reminded the men who flew through it that the atmosphere up here was not designed for human occupation. Into that violet sky, the 8th Air Force sent more than 700 heavy bombers. Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke was watching them from the cockpit of a machine that looked, next to the sleep fighters around it, like a blacksmith's idea of an aircraft. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not elegant, it was not graceful, it was enormous, nearly 7 tons of combat-loaded weight hanging from wings that seemed almost too short for the job, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine that displaced so much cubic footage it required its own supercharger the size of a domestic appliance simply to function at altitude. The pilots who flew it called it the Jug, partly for its shape and partly because flying it in certain maneuvers felt approximately like being inside one. It carried 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 more than most fighters of the era, and enough ammunition to sustain fire for over 30 seconds of continuous shooting, which in aerial combat was approximately 29 seconds more than most engagements required. Zempke was nearly 30 years old, which made him ancient by fighter pilot standards. He had come to the cockpit not through recklessness or a boyhood love of speed, but through the same methodical progression he applied to everything. Forestry studies in Montana, military training, a pre-war assignment in the Soviet Union, observing Red Air Force tactics that would have been career-ending for a less trusted officer. He had built the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolf Pack, into the highest-scoring fighter unit in the 8th Air Force, not by inspiring speeches, but by relentless tactical discipline, by teaching his pilots to fly the Jug the way it needed to be flown, rather than the way instinct suggested. The instinct, when sitting in the Thunderbolt, was to feel heavy, to feel slow, to look across the formation at the slim, graceful P-51 Mustangs with their liquid-cooled engines and their long noses and think, those are the real fighters. Zempke had spent 2 years teaching his men to suppress that instinct and replace it with physics. The physics said, what goes up must come down, and 7 tons comes down faster than anything. Before we push the throttle forward, if you're the kind of person who believes the real stories of the air war deserve more than a paragraph in a history textbook, hit the like button below. It keeps this channel alive in the algorithm. Subscribe so you don't miss the next mission, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from and whether anyone in your family served in the Second World War. We want to read their names. Now, back to 27,000 feet, where Hub Zemke has just seen something on the horizon that changes the texture of the morning completely. The flak over Berlin was not the sporadic ranging fire that covered secondary targets. It was a permanent weather system, a horizontal layer of black smoke punctuated by orange flashes that extended from the outer defense ring to the city center, dense enough that crews reported being able to hear the bursts inside sealed, oxygen-fed cockpits over the sound of their own engines. It was, by the clinical assessment of 8th Air Force Targeting Intelligence, the most heavily defended airspace on the European continent. The bombers were going into it anyway. That was the mission. What Zemke was watching was not the flak. His eyes were fixed on the upper sky, where a series of glinting specks had appeared above the lead combat boxes, the particular glint of aluminum catching sunlight at angles that meant the aircraft were banking, turning, organizing. The Jagdwaffe had come up to defend its capital, and it had not come up in squadron strength or wing strength. It had come up in the assembled fury of every available fighter the Luftwaffe could put into the air over its most important city. The Focke-Wulf 190s were forming into a Sturmgruppe, a line-abreast assault formation designed to present such a wide front of firepower that the bomber formations had no defensive angle that could cover all of it simultaneously. It was the aerial equivalent of a line of infantry walking forward with bayonets fixed, betting that the sheer width of the advance would overwhelm any single point of resistance. Zemke's voice on the radio carried no drama. It carried the tone of a man announcing a weather condition. Wolfpack, drop tanks, arm your guns. Bandits forming above the lead box, 12 o'clock high. Follow me. The external tanks fell away. The throttle went forward past its stop. The R-2800 engine, all 2,000 horsepower of it, stopped murmuring and started roaring, the kind of sound that a man feels in the back of his skull rather than hears with his ears. Zempke rolled inverted and put the nose straight down. The Thunderbolt fell like the object it resembled, dense, accelerating, entirely committed. The airspeed indicator moved through 400 miles per hour, through 450, touching 500 as the German formation rushed upward to fill the gun sight. The aerodynamic load on the control surfaces made the stick feel like it was set in concrete, requiring both hands and serious intent to move at all. The sound outside the canopy became something beyond noise, a physical pressure that pushed against the plexiglass and filled the cockpit with a vibration that made the instrument needles blur. The lead Focke-Wulf pilot saw him coming, saw 7 tons of American fighter dropping vertically out of the sun at 500 miles per hour and made the only rational decision available. He broke formation. And when the lead aircraft breaks in a line-abreast assault formation, the line ceases to exist. The Focke-Wulfs scattered laterally, their coordinated attack dissolving into individual survival decisions, the bomber boxes flying through untouched. Zempke hadn't fired a single round. He hauled back on the stick at 16,000 feet, the G-forces draining his vision to gray at the edges, the Thunderbolt groaning through the pullout with the structural protest of a machine being asked to do something violent. He leveled off and reached for the radio to call his flight together. The frequency was a wall of noise, voices over voices, warnings over warnings, the compressed chaos of 100 pilots talking simultaneously in the narrow bandwidth of the VHF tactical channel. Somewhere in that noise were his wingmen. He could not find them. He looked left. He looked right. He checked his mirrors. The sky around Hub Zemke was empty of friendly aircraft. He was alone. At 16,000 feet, directly above Berlin, in the most contested airspace of the European war, and out of the clouds to his right, 3 black shapes were materializing with the particular speed of aircraft that have already committed to an attack. Messerschmitt Bf 109s, 3 of them, diving. The clock on the longest 19 minutes of Zemke's life had just started running. The geometry of the situation was as clear as a diagram on a chalkboard and approximately as pleasant to read. 3 Bf 109G models in a coordinated diving attack coming from altitude against a single P-47 that had just expended the kinetic energy of its previous dive and was hanging in the thin air at 16,000 feet with the sluggish, coal-heavy quality of an aircraft in energy deficit.
The Messerschmitt Gustav weighed roughly half what the Thunderbolt did. In a turning fight, a natural instinct of any pilot suddenly facing three enemies, the 109s would simply orbit inside Zemke's turning radius until one of them drifted into a firing position, at which point the arithmetic concluded with unpleasant finality.
The leader of the German flight was not wasting time on subtlety. He was already in his attack dive. His two wingmen stepped back behind him in the shooter-cover arrangement that the Luftwaffe had refined over 4 years of war. He closed the distance with the confidence of a man who has calculated the odds and found them entirely satisfactory. Zempke shoved the throttle past its mechanical limit into war emergency power. The water injection system, a feature that allowed the R-2800 to briefly exceed its rated output by cooling the cylinder heads with a fine mist of water and methanol, kicked in with an effect that the pilots described as the engine suddenly deciding it had been holding back. The power output jumped past 2,300 horsepower. The massive propeller disc bit into the thin air with renewed fury. At 300 yards, the German leader opened fire. The impacts on the Thunderbolt were not subtle. A 20mm Minengeschoss shell, a thin-walled, high-explosive round specifically designed to maximize fragmentation damage rather than penetration, detonated against the right wing root with a crack that Zempke felt through the airframe before he heard it. Machine gun rounds walked a line across the fuselage behind his seat, each impact a distinct metallic statement of intent. The cockpit filled briefly with the sharp, acrid smell of burned metal and hot propellant. In a Spitfire or a Mustang, hits to the wing root and fuselage at this angle would have found the cooling lines, the narrow, pressurized tubes carrying the glycol mixture that kept a liquid-cooled engine alive. A single puncture meant a temperature rise that couldn't be stopped. It meant minutes of engine life remaining, measured against the miles between Berlin and England. The R-2800 radial engine did not have cooling lines. It was air-cooled, a ring of massive cylinders arranged around a central crankshaft, each one essentially self-contained, each one capable of absorbing damage that would have been catastrophic in any other power plant. Behind Zemke's head sat an armor plate that the Republic engineers had sized to stop the exact caliber of rounds the Luftwaffe was currently putting into it. The Thunderbolt shuddered. It absorbed. It kept flying. Zempke had one window, the moment immediately after the German leader's firing pass, when the 109's speed would carry it past the Thunderbolt before its pilot could decelerate and reset. The P-47's hydraulically boosted control surfaces gave it a roll rate at high speed that its heavier airframe would not suggest, a quality that the Bf-109, whose ailerons became progressively more resistant as airspeed climbed, could not match. He kicked the rudder hard and snapped the stick sideways with everything his arms had. The Thunderbolt rolled with startling aggression for its size, the horizon rotating violently through the canopy as the aircraft pivoted around its longitudinal axis. The German leader's firing solution, calculated for a target maintaining its current flight path, suddenly led to empty air. The 109 flashed past Zempke's canopy, close enough that he could see the individual exhaust stacks on its engine cowling, its pilot's helmeted head visible for a fraction of a second as the aircraft went by. The German had overshot. Zempke reversed the roll instantly, a maneuver that cost him in G-forces what it gained him in positioning, slamming him from one side of the harness to the other with the abrupt physics of a vehicle that has changed its mind at speed. He pulled the nose up. The climbing Bf-109 appeared in his gun sight as if placed there by an instructor demonstrating the ideal firing solution. Wings level, canopy exposed, engine running at maximum output in a climb that was bleeding its energy away with every second. Zempke squeezed the trigger and held it. 850 caliber Browning machine guns firing simultaneously produce a sound and a physical vibration that pilots consistently describe as something beyond the concept of firing a weapon. It is closer to the aircraft briefly becoming a different kind of machine, a machine whose primary function is the conversion of ammunition into destruction, with flight as a secondary consideration. The Thunderbolt's nose lit up with a muzzle flash. The combined rate of fire exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute. At 250 yards, against an aircraft that weighed 7,000 pounds and was built from materials chosen for performance rather than structural redundancy, the effect was not incremental. The Bf-109 came apart. Not gracefully, not in the cinematic slow motion of a film where a damaged fighter trails smoke and spirals down while the pilot wrestles heroically with the controls. It came apart the way things come apart when sufficient energy is applied to insufficient structure. Suddenly, completely. The right wing departing from the fuselage in a manner that the engineering literature would describe as catastrophic failure, and that Zempke, flying through the resulting debris field, would describe in his debrief with the word disintegrated. One down, 14 minutes remaining. The two surviving German pilots had now watched their flight leader eliminated in a sequence that had lasted approximately 4 seconds and had inverted every assumption they had arrived with. They were not demoralized, they were angry, which in a combat pilot is frequently more dangerous than confidence. They reorganized with the discipline of trained professionals and set about the task of killing the damaged American aircraft from 2 angles simultaneously, one aircraft high and one aircraft low, a pincer that would force Zempke to commit to a single threat and accept the other. Below him, the radio had become a record of catastrophe. The bomber crews were calling in wounded aircraft, lost engines, crew members down. The main German fighter force had reached the B-17s. The sky over Berlin had become, in the language of the after-action reports, a target-rich environment for both sides. Zempke checked his fuel. He checked his ammunition. He looked at the damage indicator and noted the hydraulic pressure reading with the expression of a man noting a problem he intends to solve later. He pulled the stick back and climbed toward the 2 remaining Germans. There is a category of decision in aerial combat that the training manuals classify as tactically unsound and that experienced pilots sometimes make anyway, not from recklessness, but from a cold, precise understanding that the tactically sound option leads to the same outcome as the unsound one, only more slowly. Zempke's tactically sound option was to dive for the deck, use the Thunderbolt's unmatched high-speed descent to open a gap no Bf-109 could close and put miles between himself and the 2 remaining Germans while nursing his damaged aircraft toward the channel. The problem with this option was the bomber stream directly above him, still taking losses, still needing the thing that his presence provided, even damaged and alone, the unpredictability of a fighter in the area that was willing to engage. An escort that runs is not an escort, it is a departure. He climbed. The 2 German pilots had positioned themselves with the textbook patience of men who understood their advantages. One aircraft held the high position, sitting at 21,000 feet, engine throttled back to conserve fuel, watching the American climb toward him with the detached attention of a sniper watching a target close the range. The second aircraft had taken the low angle, below and behind, waiting for Zempke to commit upward before sliding in on the unprotected tail. It was a bracket, a scissors laid open in the sky. Move toward one blade and the other closes behind you. Zempke had been teaching his pilots to defeat this setup for 2 years. The answer required accepting a temporary vulnerability in exchange for removing one of the 2 threats decisively, which then converted the 2 against 1 into a 1 against 1, where the odds were at worst manageable and at best favorable, given what the Thunderbolt could do to a 109 in the right geometry. He flew wide arcs, maintaining his airspeed above 300 miles per hour, denying the low German the slow-turning fight he needed to work into firing position. The Bf-109 at lower altitude was burning fuel pursuing a target that kept moving the geometry, kept the angles wrong, kept the firing solution just slightly ahead of where it needed to be.
Zempke could hear the German pilot's frustration in the shape of his maneuvers, the tightening turns that were trading fuel for position, the small altitude gains that telegraphed the next attack angle. When the high German finally committed to a diving attack, the calculation made that Zempke's attention on the low threat had opened a window. Zempke did something that a pilot in a lighter aircraft would have considered suicidal.
He chopped the throttle to idle and kicked the rudder. The Thunderbolt skidded sideways through the air. Its enormous flat side presented briefly to the airflow like a barn door opening, shedding speed with the abruptness of a vehicle that has found a wall. The effect on the Germans' firing solution was the aerial equivalent of a pedestrian suddenly sitting down in the middle of a crosswalk. The calculation that had been correct a half-second earlier was now wrong by a margin too large to correct at closing speed. The cannon shells passed in front of Zempke's canopy rather than through his cockpit, the German pilot's aim arriving where the Thunderbolt had been rather than where it was. Zempke rammed the throttle forward again. The R-2800 didn't hesitate. He had been fighting for 10 minutes. His neck felt as though someone had been standing on it. The G-forces of the repeated violent maneuvers, the rolls, the skids, the high-speed reversals, had been working his body the way a machine works material it is trying to reshape, with pressure applied in directions the material doesn't prefer. His flight suit was soaked. The cockpit temperature, which had started the mission at 55 below outside and marginally less than that inside, had climbed enough from the physical exertion that his visor was fogging intermittently. He pointed the Thunderbolt's nose at the high German and selected a head-on intercept angle. The geometry of a head-on pass at combined closing speeds approaching 700 miles per hour reduces the decision time to something that the conscious mind cannot fully process. The choice must be made before the moment it becomes relevant, committed to while the outcome is still theoretical. The German pilot was looking at a P-47 Thunderbolt's frontal profile, not an inviting target, a massive radial engine and 8 gun muzzles arranged across a span of wings that seemed to fill the available sky. Zempke fired at 400 yards. The German broke at 350. He broke right, which exposed the left side of his fuselage to the final quarter-second of Zempke's burst. The glycol line that fed the Bf-109's cooling system ran along the left fuselage, protected by approximately the thickness of aluminum that the weight budget had allowed after the engine, the weapons, the pilot, and the fuel had taken their shares. The armor-piercing rounds did not respect that budget. The white stream began immediately, thin at first, then thickening into a plume that told every pilot in visual range exactly what had happened and exactly what would happen next. The German rolled away and pushed the nose down, buying altitude to convert into glide distance, looking for a field that would accept a dead-stick landing before the engine temperature reached the number that meant fire. 2 down. 15 minutes elapsed. 1 German remaining. The last pilot was the dangerous kind, the kind that watches 2 colleagues get destroyed and does not leave. He stayed. He worked the high position patiently, looking for the mistake that Zempke had not yet made, the moment of inattention or physical exhaustion that would open the angle he needed. For 4 more minutes, Zempke denied him that moment. Not through superhuman ability, but through the accumulated habit of a man who had been doing this longer than almost anyone else in the theater, the constant head movement, the mirror checks on a rhythm that became unconscious, the subtle speed management that kept the Thunderbolt just above the turn rate the 109 needed to work into a firing solution. The German's fuel made the decision that his will had refused to make. At the 19-minute mark, a final burst of cannon fire fell behind Zempke's tail. Not a committed attack, the gesture of a man who has accepted the outcome but needs to mark the moment. And the Bf-109 rolled away, its nose dropping toward the deck, heading east toward an airfield that Zempke would never know the name of. The sky, for the first time in 19 minutes, contained only 1 aircraft in Zempke's immediate vicinity, his own. The silence after a prolonged engagement settles onto a pilot the way physical exhaustion settles onto a body, not all at once but in layers, each one revealing another underneath it. Zemke became aware of his hands first, which were trembling slightly against the stick and throttle with the fine motor tremor of muscles that have been operating under sustained maximum stress. Then the thirst, the profound, specific thirst of a man who has been breathing pure oxygen through a rubber mask for several hours and has been sweating inside a sealed flight suit for the last 20 minutes of that time. Then the damage. He ran his eyes across the instrument panel with the systematic attention he gave it every few minutes regardless of circumstances. Airspeed, altitude, engine temperature, fuel, oil pressure, hydraulic pressure. Most of the readings were within acceptable ranges. One was not. The hydraulic pressure gauge showed a value that meant the system was functional for now, but drawing from a reservoir that had been compromised by the earlier hits. Landing gear, operation, flap operation, the things that converted a flying machine back into a machine that could land without killing its pilot.
He had roughly an hour of flying time between himself and RAF Halesworth on the Suffolk coast, assuming the fuel calculations held and the hydraulic system didn't fail further, and the damaged wing root held its structural integrity at the speeds he needed to maintain for the crossing. He descended to low altitude, not the treetop flying that the term implies, but low enough that German radar coverage became patchy, low enough that the flak batteries tracking his route had to make targeting decisions faster than their fire control systems preferred. He flew with the deliberate, measured attention of a man who has used up most of his margin and is managing what remains with precision. He leaned the fuel mixture to extract maximum range from each gallon, monitoring the exhaust temperature to find the edge where efficiency lived just short of the line where the engine began to protest. The German landscape passed beneath him, flat in the north, then rising into the hills that preceded the Rhine, then the river itself, wider than the maps suggested, and then the flat agricultural plains of occupied France, stretching toward the coast. He had flown this route enough times in enough conditions that it had a familiar quality even when everything else was unfamiliar. He knew the landmarks. He knew approximately where the German radar stations were positioned and where the gaps in their coverage created corridors a single aircraft could use without painting itself on a screen. He crossed the Channel coast with enough fuel to make the field and no meaningful surplus. The hydraulic system held.
The landing gear came down on the first selection, locked into position with the reassuring thump that meant the mechanical backup had engaged even if the hydraulic pressure was marginal. Zempke brought the Thunderbolt onto the steel matting runway at Halesworth with the deliberate, grease-it-on smoothness of a man who has no desire to discover what happens if he bounces it. The ground crew reached the aircraft before the propeller had fully stopped. They were quiet men, most of them trained out of the verbal reactions that civilian life had given them, the exclamations, the visible alarm at visible damage. They moved around the Thunderbolt in their practiced way, reading the aircraft the way a doctor reads a patient, their faces professional and still. But the stillness required more effort than usual. The right wing's damage was significant, the torn metal around the 20mm impact point gaping wide enough to put a forearm through. The surrounding skin puckered and creased where the shockwave had traveled the structure looking for somewhere to go. The fuselage behind the cockpit carried a row of machine gun impacts that tracked diagonally across the metal like a sentence written in a language no one wanted to read. The hydraulic fluid that had been weeping from the damaged line since over Berlin had dried into a brown streak along the underside of the fuselage. Zemke's crew chief counted the damage with the expression of a man confirming what he already suspected and finding the confirmation slightly worse than hoped. He didn't say anything to Zempke about the aircraft. He said, "We'll have her ready." Inside the debriefing room, Zempke sat across a table from an intelligence officer with a fresh notepad and gave him the engagement in the same sequence it had occurred, without elaboration or emphasis, the same quality of narration he would have used to describe a training flight. The officer wrote it down and asked clarifying questions, and wrote those down too.
When the session ended, Zemke stood up and went to look at the mission board to understand what had happened to the rest of the Wolfpack. What had happened to March 6, 1944 was this. The 8th Air Force had lost 69 heavy bombers over Berlin, 690 men, in a single day. A loss rate that, sustained for 2 more weeks, would have ended the strategic bombing campaign by simple arithmetic. There would not have been enough crews left to fill the aircraft. The fighter escort had claimed 81 German fighters in exchange. It was, by the clinical standard of attrition warfare, a favorable ratio. It was the kind of number that looks acceptable in a report and feels like something different when you stand next to the empty hardstands where the aircraft used to park. Zemke would continue flying combat until October of 1944, when his P-51 Mustang, having transferred to command the 497th Fighter Group, he had transitioned to the Mustang, an aircraft he never quite trusted the way he trusted the Jug, came apart in a severe storm over Germany. The structural failure was not combat damage, it was the indifferent violence of weather applied to an airframe at the wrong moment. He bailed out and was captured. The Germans, processing the papers of their new prisoner, discovered they had caught the commander of the Wolfpack and moved him to a camp for senior officers.
This was, from a certain angle, a mistake. Zemke organized the Allied prisoners in his camp with the same systematic efficiency he had applied to the 56th Fighter Group. By the final weeks of the war, when the German administration of the camp had effectively collapsed, it was Zemke who was running it. The same man who had spent 2 years killing German pilots, now responsible for keeping their prisoners safe until the Allied armies arrived. He came home after the war and continued in the Air Force for another decade and a half. He was not a man who generated the kind of mythology that accrued to the more flamboyant pilots of the war. He didn't have the story of breaking the sound barrier, or the raccoon tail flying helmet, or the famous quote that everyone knew. What he had was a record of missions flown, of pilots trained, of a group that he had built from scratch and led through the worst days of the air war over Europe without losing himself in either the fear or the glory. He died in 1994. He was 80 years old. There are no recordings of his voice in the combat radio transcripts that survive. The voices that come through on the scratchy VHF recordings from the 8th Air Force missions tend to be the voices of urgency, pilots calling warnings, calling positions, calling for help. Zemke's calls tended to be brief, declarative, and already in the past tense by the time anyone else had a chance to react to the situation he was describing. Drop tanks, arm guns, follow me.
On March 6, 1944, above Berlin, one pilot had followed that instruction into a 60-fighter engagement and came out the other side alone, damaged and still not finished. What the Thunderbolt had provided was structure, the physical robustness to absorb what a lighter aircraft could not, the diving performance to escape what a slower aircraft could not, the firepower to conclude what a less armed aircraft could not. What Zemke provided was the judgment to use all of those qualities in the right sequence at the right moment, which is the thing that cannot be engineered into an airframe no matter how carefully the designers work. The aircraft was a flying anvil. The pilot was the arm that swung it. If this story found you today, if you didn't know that a 7-ton fighter survived 19 minutes alone above Berlin on a day that cost the 8th Air Force 69 bombers, please hit that like button. It takes 1 second and it tells the algorithm that real history, the kind without shortcuts and simplified heroes, is worth showing to people. Subscribe if you haven't already. We go into the cockpit, into the cold, into the 19 minutes that the history books describe in a single sentence if they describe them at all. And leave a comment. Did someone in your family serve in the air war over Europe? As a pilot, a crewman, a ground mechanic who kept these machines flying with bare hands in freezing English winters? Tell us their name. Tell us what they flew and where they flew it. We read every single one, and these names deserve to exist somewhere outside of a fading photograph in a shoebox. Zempke didn't run when the odds said he should. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.